Thank you for joining today's webinar, Achieving and Maintaining Compliance with NYDFS Cybersecurity Regulation. My name is Jason Gostetic, and I'll be your host for today's call. It is my pleasure to introduce our three expert presenters to you. Antonio Anderson is the Executive Director of Information Security Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Trustmark Companies, and is responsible for the management of technology risk, IT governance, IT compliance, and overall risk management across the enterprise. Prior to joining Trustmark Companies, Antonio was the Senior Security Cloud Specialist at CenturyLink, a global communications, hosting, cloud, and IT services company. John Ford is founder and CEO of Sienna Group, a leading provider of data-centric security solutions to help organizations protect their most sensitive information. John has more than 20 years compliance and information security, including C-level information security and compliance roles with several Fortune 500 companies. Yomar Rosendo is the domain expert for the Data Security Group of Informatica, the leader in enterprise cloud data management. Yomar is responsible for the business development strategy in the US regarding the data security solutions, including data-centric security, secure testing, and secure archive. For the first 3 years in Informatica, she was assigned to Europe, Middle East, and Africa regions. We are especially grateful to the Trustmark companies for their willingness to share their NYDFS compliance journey with their financial industry peers on today's webinar. Trustmark is a national employee benefits company with deep, specialized expertise in self-funded health benefit administration, voluntary benefits, and wellness and fitness management. Trustmark brings products and services usually reserved for larger employers to organizations of all sizes. I'd now like to turn today's webinar over to John Ford. John, you may begin.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, everybody, for joining the call today. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day. Today, we're going to talk to Antonio about his compliance journey. I'm also joined, as Jason just introduced, folks from Informatica, Yomar, and together, hopefully this will be a fruitful presentation for you. On this particular slide, I just want to start off by saying I think everybody on the call is aware that there's several key provisions of the New York DFS regulation. Today, however, we're really going to be focusing on the data discovery and retention component, which would fall into that 500.13 limitations on data retention. I think everybody's aware of the importance of this regulation, and as we go forward, we'll be talking with Antonio about his journey. Before we get there, though, I would like to just state that we will have some polling questions that will be popping up on your screen. Please feel free to answer them, and I think we're ready to go. So, Antonio, thanks again for coming, for joining us today in this webinar. We appreciate you taking time out of your day and appreciate you sharing your journey with the folks on the call. I put together a series of questions that I'd like to ask and just, have it more conversational approach as opposed to static. So let me just jump right in. I mean, obviously, Trustmark has a wealth of experience operating in regulated environments. Can you give us a little bit of perspective on how your compliance journey began for New York DFS, as well as, not just from a Trustmark perspective, but from you and your role in the company?
Absolutely. And John, thanks for having me here today. So really quick, just to give you some backdrop, my role as governance, risk, and compliance at Trustmark is a newly created role. It's an organic role. And the role came about back in January of 2017. And the primary reason behind the role was for compliance with NYDFS. NYDFS, as you know, is a brand new law. The law went into effect March 1st of 2017. And the first thing we had to do was understand or come up with the interpretation of the law. So it was the first, and I won't say the first of its kind, but I would look at NYDFS and compare it to HIPAA. And if you can relate to HIPAA, HIPAA was very ambiguous when it first came out. A lot of organizations had a tough time trying to digest and interpret what the regulation meant. And it was no different with NYDFS. So the first thing we had to do was organize internally and get our arms around what would compliance look like to us. So that meant partnering with my legal team, partnering with my compliance team, bringing in InfoSec, bringing in IT, and the leaders of those particular organizations to come up with what is compliance for NYDFS. And then we had to look at performing a gap analysis. And because we are heavily regulated by HIPAA, we looked at the outliers between what we were doing for HIPAA and what the new reg around NYDFS would require. And one of the gaps that had came up, and when I call it a gap, I mean, we had policies, processes, and procedures, but they were not clearly defined, nor were they enforceable. And that's the key. When you start talking about compliance, you want to put yourself in a position where if you have policies, processes, and procedures, those things have teeth to them, but they are also what I would call enforceable. So from there, one of the things that came up was data retention. And data retention is where we found we had somewhat of a gap.
Okay. Very good. So it sounds like beginning part, the place where you started was interpretation, going back over, what you were doing currently from a HIPAA perspective, see where that mapped, and then obviously, the topic of today, focus on data retention. With respect to data retention, I mean, what did you feel was going to be the biggest challenge for Trustmark?
Well, once again, like I said, we had policies, processes, and procedure in place, but we had no way to really enforce or manage those policies, processes, and procedures. So we first had to get our arms around what was missing. And a big part of this, when you start talking about data retention, although it's two words, it's a very huge undertaking. Because in data retention, just what it says, you're trying to figure out what data do you need to keep within your four walls. But then another part of that is what data do you need to dispose of. So we have to figure out, one, what data do we have? So you need a way to identify that data. Two, what data should we keep? So you need some way of classifying that data. And then once you have a way to discover and then classify, now you have the building blocks to figure out what retention periods you want to maintain, as well as what data you want to discard. However, NYDFS, like most regulations, they do not specify maximums. They specify minimums. And the minimums were around logs and things like that, but not your real, your core data sets. So we have to figure out, what will be our maximum, right? And there, once again, there's no regulation that tells you need to keep data for this long of a period. They tell you the minimums you need to retain. So once you tying it all back together, finding a solution set that could, one, meet our requirements around identifying, classifying, and then actually enforcing whatever retention period we came up with was one challenge. And then the next hurdle, once you identify that technology set or that tool set, is always trying to gain funding.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because we've worked together on this project, and there was at a point where it appeared that new requirements came out of Trustmark based upon the direction that you folks wanted to go, both from implementation before true products were identified, but you had a vision of how you wanted to handle the New York DFS regulation with respect to data classification and retention. So can you talk about those requirements, as far as internal requirements versus looking outside from a cloud perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So here at Trustmark, and I'm pretty sure at most companies around the country, are looking at some type of what I would call cloud strategy. So we're no different. Our strategy for cloud and for our current data center is not to bring anything else in. I mean, if you're looking to move your primary data center into the cloud or outsource it to some other provider, the last thing you want to do is bring something else in-house. Mm-hmm. So when we started evaluating our vendors, we had our list of business requirements, our list of technical requirements, and the business requirements were straightforward. I mean, one, from a business perspective, you always want to work with a partner you can trust. You want to look across the table and see that person or organization that person represents can actually deliver. The next thing you would want to look at is the technology set that they represent. You want to make sure that the technology set could represent and meet the needs of your technical requirements. The third thing would be the overall legal capacity. The entity needed to be able to meet the legal requirements that we set forth, because like some organizations, we are both a covered entity and a BAA. So any partner that we work with need to be able to fulfill those obligations to us as a covered entity and us as a business associate. And then from there, what is always important, but you notice I listed last of the four things that I look for in a partner, was economic feasibility. How does it work with our budget? So from there, we get into the technical requirements, and one of the bigger things was looking for a partner that can actually deliver a service to meet our needs from a cloud perspective. And that's when I reached out to Sienna. But I also worked with a few other providers. And, of course, when you talk about moving large amounts of data or any type of ETL solution set, the majority of the providers out there would like to be on-prem because they have beliefs that if the technology set sits within your four walls, it reduces bandwidth requirements, it reduces latency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But as I started to work with Sienna and started looking at some of the things that you all were doing from a cloud perspective, it was a no-brainer.
Okay, excellent. And along the way, I know we talked about there was, a component where you got to where you started looking externally, and then, talk to a little bit about the challenges of, when you're looking to partner with a company and, to satisfy your requirements. There's a lot of stakeholders at Trustmark that I'm sure, you work through. Can you talk a little bit about that process? Because I've been on both sides of this. I've been that CISO and bringing in partners, and sometimes, when you're introducing those partners to stakeholders, how you begin that journey, how you start introducing the concept of, hey, I think we need a couple more hands and legs here, right? We're not going to be able to get there alone. Can you just share a little bit of that?
Absolutely. So we started this journey, like I said, back in 2017. I believe when I started doing my research and looking for a particular partner, and I started querying vendors, I had input from my compliance team. I had input from my VP of architecture. I had input from my VP of operations, and I also had input from my CISO in their supporting organizations. And of course, with guidance from my infrastructure team, they were very adamant about not moving more technology into our four walls. My compliance team, they were more concerned about how do we look to solve for different data sets and different systems that are scattered around the organization. And from my legal team, they had concerns about how do you consistently set up a deletion capability for retention, because part of retention is to delete. They had concerns about modifying data. They had concerns about deleting data that was considered to be on legal hold. So a mix of organizations or departments within the organization had a lot of weigh in that decision. And when we brought in our partner, which is Sienna, Sienna had to meet with those leaders of each organization and actually help put their mind at ease that this was the right technology set to work with.
Cool. A lot of heavy lifting, right? When you're endeavoring to go down a process like this. But there's a couple of things, and you and I have talked about this separately, but, there's this piece of this where you may have felt like you could have used more time. Perhaps you can, for people in the audience who may be in the middle of going through a data retention project, are there any little hints that you could provide in hindsight that you felt would have given you, like you might have needed more time on as far as getting to the solution where you are today?
Well, absolutely. Time is the one thing you can't get enough of these days, especially when it comes to implementing a data retention solution. You have to think about what data retention is, because it's one of the technologies that actually, if you do it and you're doing it correctly, it impacts the entire organization. So you have to roll this out. You need to have messaging. You need to soft shoe it, because now you're taking a 100-year-old company with a culture that is not used to doing certain activities. So messaging becomes very important, and timing around messaging, from your executive leadership team down to your senior leadership team down to all the associates, where you're trying to get them on board and behind this new technology before you roll it out. Because when you start thinking about classification, for instance, classification, if you're the type of individual that types an email and like to hit send literally 0.5 seconds after you type it, well, classification will cause a major disruption in your organization, because now you can't type an email and hit send. You have to type an email, pause, read something. So now you have a 3 to 5 second delay, possibly. So that's very disruptive to an organization. The next part about the thing around time is training. How do you ensure everyone gets the training and understand that now you're going to start imposing conditions on them that they're not used to? So now, if I come to you and say, hey, John, in 30 days, I'm going to start deleting files, and you're an individual who has been at the company for more than 15 to 20 years, which is 50% of my workforce. And I tell you, I'm now about to start deleting files that are more than 7 years old.
Yeah.
The amount of heartburn that caused with just mentioning that statement, time would have made it easier to communicate and get the messaging out to help them understand the drivers behind it.
Sure, and of course you have deadlines that are associated with NYDFS. They're integrated deadlines. I think we have a slide on that we'll show briefly a little bit later. But, we also talked about implementing, the right technologies at the right time based upon Trustmark's requirements. And thankfully we were able to leverage, great partners like Informatica to assist in that. But one of the key components that we talked about early on for your requirements was getting the right metrics in place to support adherence to the regulation, and such that you would have, access to those metrics, right? So it's one thing to identify data, classify data, but if you can't see the behavior of like NPI type information, and you don't have the metrics to support it on a day-to-day basis, you really don't know if you're compliant or not. So, you want to share a little bit about that from your perspective?
Well, absolutely. So anytime you roll out a new technology set and you're dealing with compliance, you're dealing with security, and you're dealing with auditors or regulators in general, you need a way to show success. You need a way to show evidence that you are doing what you say you are doing. Now, one thing we have not talked about is the need to attest annually and certify. That's one of the biggest differences with NYDFS in comparison when you compare it to HIPAA. Because HIPAA, you do a self-assessment, and something physically has to, or someone or something, some event has to physically trigger OCR or HSS to come out and investigate you or audit you. NYDFS is a little different because, one, if you are in the financial services industry in any form or fashion and you are doing business in the state of New York, they have already started to have mandated audits. They mandate audits every 3 to 5 years. So that's not new, but this self-attestation on an annual basis where you certify that you are compliant, that's a little bit more rigorous. So now, and it has not happened yet because it's still new, but I anticipate when your audit comes up for the state of New York that they are going to come out and they are going to challenge you to produce evidence that you are doing the things that you say you are doing to be compliant and that you have certified. So having the ability to measure and monitor your success on a regular basis and get the necessary reports and have those defined with metrics that you can produce with a few clicks of a button is something that is a hard requirement for me and for the organization. And of course, my CISO, he loves the fact that now he can take a report and he can show where we are or where we're going on a regular basis.
Sure, and it allows you to pivot because you can see areas where you may need to make improvements or changes in behavior of how the company is operating around that type of data would cause a reflection. So thank you. I think I know we have a bunch of questions coming up. I know we have a slide that we're going to get through. We're going to talk a little bit about. I'll talk a little bit about the Sienna approach when we look at process, leading with process, and then I'll turn it over to Yomar from Informatica. And then I think we'll take some questions. But Antonio, it's been it's been great going down this journey with you and Trustmark. We love the measured approach that you folks have taken, and as we're going through this, we're very excited for you and your team and support of your compliance efforts with New York DFS. And there'll be plenty of questions coming your way in a few minutes.
Thank you, John.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about from a perspective of where we see the world as far as the journey of compliance with New York DFS. And I want to state that we've been fortunate at Sienna Group to be able to partner with some very great companies like Trustmark and Informatica. Because really, it's very, very difficult to go down this type of a process and just assume that there is a one-size-fits-all. These companies like Trustmark are very large companies. They have integrated solutions that are already in place. And then, to be able to work with a company like Informatica to help blend in to satisfy the requirements has been great. But I wanted to share some thoughts that we see with some of our customers along this journey. And the first one really is, like where to start, the steps for success. I think first and foremost, and Antonio touched on this, is this really is not an IT project or a security project. This is a company-wide effort with many stakeholders, and perhaps one of the most important, if not the most important, is working with the legal teams. What we try to start with at Sienna with our customers is get to the legal folks quickly, because as Antonio mentioned, it's their interpretation that needs to be filtered through any governance process. And starting, going down a road of changing policies or implementing technology or starting a direction without their guidance is really, it's in most cases, it's a non-starter. It certainly would be an ineffective use of time and budget. But having said that, we generally like to start once we have that interpretation of going through the governance process of looking through policies and procedures, as Antonio mentioned, and perhaps probably one of the most important items is the communication, planning, and guidelines, and ensuring that everybody in the organization knows what's coming. That's a big deal. We tend to spend a fair amount of time on that. There are some things that Antonio and I we didn't get into, but I'm sure it might come up in the Q&A. But one of the things that we have talked about is specific data handling guideline updates, breach notification procedures. All of those have to be addressed and looked at long before we arrive at, hey, what is the right technology fit for a company, right? So when we have things like that in place and we're comfortable, then we can begin to look at how do we go about identifying, classifying, protecting, and reporting on the status of data like NPI, right? Particularly for an organization where you are adhering to HIPAA, you may have PCI compliance to deal with. You have all these different data types that are regulated. You have other types of data like trade secrets and intellectual property that you want to protect. All of those have to come into play when you're looking at these types of a solution. So we like to look at leveraging technology as an enabler once we have all the facts and going with the right solution. And part of that right solution has to be something that offers a fair amount of automation so that we can get the feedback almost immediately, as to how the behavior of that data is occurring in your organization, so that you can make the associated pivots, if you will, in a continuous progress environment. Some of the items that we see that, when I look at the pitfalls to avoid, they're just really just the opposite of everything I just mentioned. But probably the biggest one is treating this as an IT problem. I mean, IT is really a friend in this regard, and putting this on an IT organization to solve is not fair to them, and really, it would probably suffer if that was the only approach that you took. And then the other thing is that we see, kind of a large pitfall is treating this as a one-off effort. As I just mentioned, your organization has tons of data it wants to protect. What you should be looking at here is blending in your commitment, what you have to, your requirements for NYDFS into your existing governance program, and not creating something new, not creating brand new data handling guidelines just for DFS. There should be just an update and an edit. So, having this become part of the fabric of your data governance program is vitally important. And if you were to go down this road as treating it as a separate project, probably would not be very successful at the end. So now I think what I'd like to do is to turn it over to our partner, Informatica, and turn it over to Yomar. I will say that it's been a pleasure working with Informatica and particularly on the Trustmark engagement, and they've really done a lot to bring satisfying the requirements through the Informatica products has been very easy for us, as opposed to trying to do this a different way. So Yomar, I'll turn it over to you, and you can give us a description and discussion on Secure at Source.
Thank you very much, John and Antonio. So from a technology point of view, Informatica Data Privacy and Protection solution is pretty much helping customers like Trustmark with their discovery and remediation of what's considered personal and sensitive data risk across the overall organization. To do this, right, we're leveraging things like artificial intelligence and also machine learning to make sure that we have a actionable and discovery and classification. We can also help Trustmark with doing risk scoring, behavioral analytics, and automated protection. Another thing that is very important key to this solution is that Informatica can also support both structured and unstructured data in the cloud, on-prem, on big data stores, as well as any of the relational and mainframe systems that are relevant to look at sensitive data risk in the overall landscape of your enterprise. As Antonio has mentioned before, with our solution, we're pretty much helping Trustmark to prioritize the data security and the retention, and we do this pretty much in 3 simple steps. First one, we can help locating, classifying, and analyzing the risk of sensitive data, and we do that across the different platforms like Oracle, SQL Server, DB2, and XML files there. To do this and to understand what those sensitive data is, we pretty much do and adapt a combination of data domains that are referring to PII data, PCI data, or PHI data, and how they link to those relevant policies and regulations that Trustmark is trying to comply with, like NYDFS or California Consumer Privacy Act or GDPR in the context of a global scape. In the second approach, we are continuously monitoring and measuring the risk scoring, right? So this is where we also provide a centralized dashboard where you can look at the risk based on multiple factors like data sensitivity, volume, protection, proliferation of the data, location, and also user activity. We do that, and now with that information, as we scan through the different data sources that Trustmark has, we help also with the visualization of the information by department, by application, by user, or even by data storage type. And then another thing that is very key to that continuous monitoring is actually looking at how the data is moving through the organization, tracking the proliferation of the data and the copies that are being done of the sensitive information both inside and outside the enterprise. And thirdly, Trustmark is pretty much identifying also what is the critical priorities that they want to apply to the data based on the retention, or also by enforcing that automation and remediation that they need to do, leveraging solutions like Informatica Data Archive or persistent data masking, dynamic data masking, or even third-party protection methods that can be as simple as a custom script that they can run, an email notification, a system log message, or the creation of a service ticket within the organizations. And of course, all these actions can be configured to run when they're triggered by a security policy violation, or run them manually as soon as they detect this potential risk that is being done there. So with Informatica and Sienna solution, we understand that we can help Trustmark in their journey to comply with NYDFS, and do that extensively to other regulations, and doing that by proactively identifying where the sensitive data risk exists, and ultimately prevent unauthorized user access to any of the sensitive data that we have. So now I'm turning it back to John so we can answer a few more questions from the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Yomar. That was a great description. And a key point there that Yomar made for the audience is that it's vital that you have a solution that can address both unstructured and structured data. And so it's been a key component for us moving forward with being able to help customers like Trustmark. So we have a couple of key dates up here on the screen. Really, no explanation needed. These are just dates for you to keep in mind as you're going through your journey. And now I think I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for questions and answers.
Thank you. If you have a question, please press star then 1 on your touch-tone phone. If you wish to be removed from the queue, please press the pound sign or the hash key. There will be a delay before the first question is announced. If you're using a speakerphone, you may need to pick up the handset first before pressing the numbers. Once again, if you have a question, please press star then 1 on your touch-tone phone.
Great, thanks, Jenny. While we're waiting for those questions to queue up, we did have a few questions that came in through the chat during the webinar today. And our first question is for Antonio. The question is, when you sought help from a third party, did you already know what technologies you wanted to deploy, or did the third party firm make recommendations based on your environment and requirements?
Well, we had an idea of what we needed, so we built our technical requirements first, and then we had our business requirements follow that, and we start to search for vendors who can, one, meet the business requirements, and two, meet the technical requirements, as I said early on. And when we landed on 3 vendors, 2 of the vendors were eliminated right away because they only had on-prem solution sets. And when we started to have more in-depth conversations with Sienna, Sienna was able to meet both our business and technical requirements. And Sienna was able to help drive and make recommendations about the different types of technology that we should deploy that will meet our technical requirements as well as our business requirements.
Great, thank you, Antonio. Jenny, any questions queued up over the phone?
No questions at this time.
Okay, great, thanks. Our next question is for John. And the question is, can you give us a sense as to the process that you use when a company like Trustmark reaches out to you?
Sure, good question. We generally try to take a very consultative approach and go through almost a discovery process. Companies like Trustmark have their own complexity, and companies that look similar to them may also have complexity, but in a totally different way. So where we like to start is really with helping develop the requirements and really just the core requirements that we're trying to achieve, and then leverage what the organization already has in place. So, the last thing we'd want to do is have a customer spend money on duplication, right? So we look at their governance approach, we look at their organizational structure, we look at the data, the type of data, how much of the data that they have, and then we come up with a plan collectively, based upon recommendations that we would make. So it's very much a consultative approach. We don't lead, generically with a solution because we're not 100% sure yet what that solution would look like. And we also try to maximize their current IT spend as well. So it's generally a discovery process, much more so than a different kind of an engagement. And then hopefully usually at the end of that discovery process we have 2 or 3 recommendations on a path to which to move forward.
Great, thanks, John. Jenny, any questions queued up?
No questions.
Okay, great, thanks. So our next question is for Yomar, and the question is, when sensitive data is found by Secure at source, can any actions be taken to protect that sensitive data?
Yes, thank you, John. Yes, definitely we can do that. We have the ability to remediate data risk by initiating different data protection workflows. This includes either integrations with other Informatica solutions like Informatica Data Archive, persistent data masking, dynamic data masking, or any other third-party solution like, for example, encryption or tokenization tools that you might have in the organization.
Great, thanks, Sienna. If there are no more questions over the phone, Jenny, we can turn this over for closing remarks.
No questions at this time.
Okay. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their day today. I want to thank, in particular, Trustmark, Antonio, as well as Yomar from Informatica. This has been a great experience doing this webinar with you, and I appreciate you taking time out of your day as well. Thank you, folks, and enjoy your day.